Hey everybody! So today we're looking at the Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895, and we're going to continue focusing on this big overarching question on this unit on China. What factors in the 1800s allowed the West to advance ahead of China? We are going to give some context, talk about self-strengthening and the self-strengthening movement that took place in the 1800s, mid-1800s. Then we'll just look at the Sino-Japanese War. I don't focus on military history, so I'm not going to talk about battles and things like that, but I do want you to understand what that war was, what happened, and then we'll analyze the source that is assigned for this part of this unit. Chu Chengbo, reforming men's minds, comes before reforming institutions. So, context. You need to understand that in the mid 1800s, following the Opium War, the first Opium War, there was a self-strengthening movement within China. And I have a definition here for you. It's a plan to maintain the essence of Chinese civilization while adopting Western advances. Some examples of this, and this is a quote from one of the advocates of self-strengthening, building ships, making weapons, and learning the superior techniques of the barbarians. So that's one way of looking at self-strengthening. Other examples of self-strengthening also included establishing translation offices and schools for students so that they could study Western languages and Western approaches to math. Just to give you some examples of individuals who advocated self-strengthening, I have two of them listed here. Feng Guifeng on the adoption of Western learning, and that document he wrote around 1850, we're not really sure exactly, and then Yan Fu, who wrote Learning from the West around 1895, definitely around that same time period as the Sino-Japanese War. But it's important to see that there were people in China who were advocating that the Chinese should adapt to Western practices and begin to modernize the same way the West had. In addition to Feng and Yan, we also had a self-strengthening advocate in the person of Zheng Guofan. Let me move my head out of the way here so you can see it. There we go. And so Zheng Guofan, we mentioned him in connection to the Taiping Rebellion, but he was one of the advocates of self-strengthening as well. And here's an excerpt of something he wrote about the Taiping Rebellion, but you see the connections there with self-strengthening. He mentions how we need to adapt, but we shouldn't lose our Confucian heritage. And we should still have some essence of what it means to be Chinese. So we have several examples of self-strengthening, and moving into the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. This is an image of the Japanese executing Chinese individuals. This war was devastating for the Chinese. The dates are a little deceptive, so it looks like it lasted for a year or so, but in reality, it only lasted from August of 1894 to April of 1895, so it was not a very long war at all. And the Chinese lost. The Chinese lost, the Japanese won, and it was a huge victory for Japan, but a terrible defeat for the Chinese. Try to think about when we looked at the First Opium War, the Chinese believed they were the Middle Kingdom, that they were at the center, and they lost to the British, a group of outsiders, a group of barbarians. That was pretty devastating to Chinese morale and to the traditions and customs that they held at that time. Fast forward several decades to this first Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese lose to Japan. So not only was China not the strongest power in the world, it was no longer even the strongest power in East Asia. So it was a very devastating loss. The Chinese had to surrender and sign a peace treaty with the Japanese. And you can see in this illustration the Chinese depicted in very traditional Chinese clothing. But look at the Japanese. Japanese appear to be in very Western, modernized clothing. So just an example of how the war reflected different approaches. The Chinese still sort of clinging to tradition, the Japanese moving ahead and modernizing like the West. So very devastating war. This next image comes from a British political cartoon. The British are depicting the Japanese and the Chinese in a very specific kind of way, and it does use some offensive language. And so you can see in this image, this is um, around the time of the Sino-Japanese War. After the war was over, you can see how this British political cartoon has depicted the Japanese samurai as a very small, tiny person standing on top of this large, bloated looking china representing the empire. The caption at the bottom is what is uh, inappropriate. At the time, it was very common to use this term uh, right down here. But we don't use this terminology anymore. This is a racial slur, and so I just want to make you aware of that. But it is common, it was common in the late 1800s to refer to Japanese people this way. But it says that they have defeated uh, the giant, the Chinese giant. Um, for the source, Chu Chengbo, reforming men's minds comes before reforming institutions. You have to think about what exactly is Chu getting at here. Notice that he was an imperial official, so that influences his perspective. He was working in the government. So why does he think that the Qing government is weak? What does he think about reform efforts of, we already mentioned Zheng Guofan, these efforts of self-strengthening, being modern, having Western style armies and factories? What did he believe was the key to strengthening the Qing dynasty? Do you agree or disagree with what he says? And if you're the emperor and Chu gives you this advice, what concrete steps would you take? What changes would you make? So that's all I got. So I'll look forward to seeing you next time.